We know that Jesus offered up his spirit at his crucifixion, so he must have a human soul with intellect and will, correct? Do the three persons of the Trinity have distinct yet inseparable souls, or do they share only one soul from the moment of the incarnation? Best regards, Mary.
Mary, that's a question that's just perfectly suited to introduce this whole topic. Because, of course, the answer to your question, which I'm going to have to explain in some detail here, is that in Jesus there is one person, one self-consciousness, but that one self-consciousness is operating through two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. And we're going to distinguish that in a moment, but to answer your question briefly and then get to the distinction of those two terms, which are really important, what you need to know is that Jesus' human soul is part of his human nature. His one self-conscious act, his person, is working through that restricted human soul, and at the same time, his one person is also working through an unrestricted act of understanding, an unrestricted act of consciousness in his divine nature. Because his divine nature is unrestricted, his human nature is restricted. So we say that he is doing both. Now, with respect to the other persons of the Trinity, they are not doing both. They are working through their divine nature alone. They did not become incarnate, and they did not retain their human nature as a bond, and as an incarnate bond to mediate humanity to divinity. So that's the answer to your question, the brief answer. Now to explain those two things, because they're huge terms. When you talk about the nature of God, so the first thing we want to talk about is the nature of God. We all know about human nature. Human nature is restricted. But the nature of God, that's unrestricted. Now, there is a very good proof of that, right? And so, of course, the minute we hear that, God's nature is unrestricted, we know right away that there can only be one divine nature. One God, we say, but it's one divine nature in God. But there are three persons using that one divine nature. Now, why do we say that an unrestricted nature, like unrestricted power or unrestricted act or unrestricted act of being or unrestricted existence, why does unrestricted existence have to be one and only one? Why can you only have one divine nature? Because think about this. Suppose you had two unrestricted beings, okay? Then one would have to have something, or be somewhere that the other one was not. Now you think to yourself, well, why would one have to have something, or be somewhere that the other one was not? Imagine just for a moment, Mary, that you didn't have two divine natures. I mean that you didn't have any difference between these two natures, right? There was no differences to activity, no differences to power, no differences to characteristics, no differences to quality, no differences to space-time point, no differences to dimension, no differences of any kind whatsoever. How many do you have? You got it. One and only one. You have the self-same entity, and the self-same entity is one and only one. So the first thing we know, Mary, by the way, did St. Augustine know this, or did the early church fathers know? Absolutely they knew it, because of course they knew Plato's proof of this. So the first thing we know is, if you're going to have two of anything, you're going to have a difference between the one and the other. And if you're going to have two unrestricted entities, there's going to have to be a difference between the one and the other. So one of them's going to have something, be somewhere that the other one is not. But think about that for a moment. The other one is not something. It is not somewhere. It does not have something that the other one does. the one that does not have that something, is not that something, is not somewhere that the other one is restricted by definition. Uh-oh, we've got a contradiction. Our second unrestricted nature has to be restricted in order to be differentiated from the first one. And if that's the case, a restricted, unrestricted entity, that contradictory entity can't exist. Contradictions are impossible. So from the get-go, we know that we can only have one and only one God. Right? I mean, we know from the get-go that there can only be one divine nature, and that is to say, one divine, unrestricted power or act. So that's the first thing we know. Now we have this doctrine called the Trinity, and of course you rightly point out, this could get confusing. Oh, believe me, many a heresy has been uttered, under the rubric of Trinity. But here's the thing to think of. One of my professors at the Gregorian University was a fellow by the name of Father Jean Gallo, and he said the best way of conceiving of a person, and I believe this is true, is to conceive of a person as self-consciousness. That is to say, that self-conscious act. And you might go back to one of our previous shows, when I was talking about self-awareness in human beings, how we could be aware of our awareness. And of course, that awareness of our awareness, I'm not just aware, for example, of my hand. I'm aware of being aware of my hand. And not only that, but I'm aware of my being aware of my awareness. I can do a triple, as it were. Now, when I'm aware of being aware of myself, I can create my own inner universe. In fact, if a divine person were aware of being aware of himself, he could also have his own inner universe. He could have his own privacy, his individual inwardness, his individual interior domain, his individual, what we call it, interior subjectivity. So, of course, now we say there are three of these interior subjectivities, as it were, within the Godhead. So that Godhead means the divine nature, the one divine nature. So there are three self-consciousnesses out there, and they're making use of this one infinite, unrestricted power source. So just think for a moment then that this one individual entity making use of this, are these three inward subjective self-consciousnesses are making use of this one individual power source. It's sort of like having three monitors attached to one central processing unit. Just a bad analogy, but it might make it easier to grasp. The main thing,
that your
though,
version of the
is so these
Shamrock
three
there or something, or what?
Yeah, exactly. So you got three self-consciousnesses making use of one infinite power source, one unrestricted power source. Now, just think for a moment, what are these persons doing? What are these self-consciousnesses doing? We're told by Jesus that they are in love. That is to say, the first self-consciousness loves the second self-consciousness. The first person loves the second person. The Father loves the Son. So the first act that we see within the Trinity, right, the first relation is the Father is loving the Son. The second relation is that the Son receives the love of the Father and loves him back. So let's call the Father a giver-receiver, and let's call the Son, which is a different relation, a receiver-giver. Now there's even a third relation. When the Father and the Son are unified with one another, remember, love always goes beyond itself. So the Father gives himself to the Son receives the act of love from the Father and gives it back to him, right? So they're now in a unity. The unity can go beyond itself. So you have basically the unity of the Father and the Son. It wants to go outside of itself, like parents want to go outside of themselves to generate children, right? And the child that they right. So the Father and Son they give themselves to the third self-consciousness, who receives the love from the Father and the Son. And that's the third relation. And then what does that third person, the Holy Spirit, do? That third self-consciousness do? It gives right back. It receives the love of the Father and the Son and gives it back to the Father and the Son in their unity.